The gun came up before his name did, and in that split second, between command and recognition, everything he'd ever earned meant nothing. The beam of the patrol car's spotlight cut through the dark lot, slicing the night into obedience. Fluorescent light from Pump 4 trembled above the black sedan, its stuttered hum fighting the silence. The man in the Navy suit, Judge Nathaniel Cross, though no one here knew that, stood still beside his car, one hand raised, the other open. Gasoline still dripped from the nozzle he'd dropped, making small silver ripples on the pavement. "Hands where I can see them." The voice came sharp, automatic, drilled by repetition. It didn't ask. It presumed. Cross obeyed. Slowly, deliberately. His heart didn't race. He wouldn't give them that. But the air felt thin, as if the night itself had pulled back to watch. Two officers moved toward him, flashlights cutting arcs through vapor. Their steps were steady, rehearsed, the rhythm of men who had done this before. One covered, the other advanced. Step away from the vehicle. He took one measured step back. His shoe met the small puddle forming beneath the pump, the reflection of the light breaking around it. "What's going on?" His voice was calm, but it carried. "Quiet, sir. We'll ask the questions." The second officer reached the trunk, eyes narrowed, scanning. "Plate matches the area, doesn't it?" "Yeah, dark sedan, late model." "That's what dispatch said." Cross blinked once. "Dispatch said what?" They ignored him. The first officer holstered his weapon but didn't lower the tension. It hung there, a third presence between them, unseen, undeniable. "Where you headed tonight?" "Home," he said. "From where?" "Work." "What kind of work?" "Legal." That word made the first officer glance up, as if testing it for threat or irony. "Legal?" Cross nodded toward the ID badge clipped to his jacket. The metal glinted briefly beneath the unsteady light, a flash too quick to read. The officer leaned closer but didn't look directly. "You mind taking that off for me?" "It's my identification." "Yeah, take it off." He unpinned the badge and held it out. The officer took it, turned it once in his palm, then slipped it into his vest pocket without looking at the engraving. The second officer called from the driver's side. "Keys in the ignition." "You leave it running?" "I was still pumping gas." "Right." The first officer circled him now, assessing not the man but the posture, the unhurried composure, the tailored jacket, the controlled breathing. It all seemed wrong here, out of place at a near-empty station past midnight. "You local?" "Yes." "Address?" "Thornwood Drive." Pause. The first officer nodded slowly, filing it away. "That's the east side, huh?" Cross didn't answer. The silence was its own correction. "Step over here for me," the officer said, gesturing toward the hood of the car. Cross's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Why?" "Routine. We just need to make sure everything checks out." He looked past them, to the store window, where a cashier stood frozen behind the counter, pretending to stock gum. The reflection of the flashing lights made her face pale. She would not remember his features later, only the posture, the stillness of a man who didn't resist and didn't beg. "Turn around," the officer said again, firmer. Cross hesitated. Not from fear, but calculation. He'd seen this choreography before, from the bench, from files, from lives reduced to affidavits and charges. He knew how one wrong motion became a case number. He turned. The cold air hit the back of his neck. Metal fingers gripped his wrist. The first cuff clicked, then the second. The sound was clean, mechanical, designed for efficiency, not mercy. "Anything sharp on you?" "Weapons? Needles?" "No." They patted him down anyway. The ritual of suspicion, each pocket, each fold of fabric, each affirmation of control. The officer who held the badge glanced at it again, this time longer. The engraved text caught a glimmer of light, Judge Nathaniel Cross, but the word honorable blurred in the reflection. He looked away uninterested. "Name checks out." The second officer, checking his radio, shrugged. "Running it now." Minutes stretched. The gas pump beeped twice, signaling completion, ignored. A siren echoed faintly somewhere far off. Another call, another night. Cross stared at the ground. A moth circled the flickering light above him, desperate for something steady to follow. The radio crackled. "Unit 12, negative match. Suspect vehicle unrelated. You're clear." Silence again. Then a cough. A shift in tone. "Seems there's been a misunderstanding," one officer said. Cross didn't move. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, voice low, each syllable deliberate. The officer fumbled for keys, unlocking the cuffs. "You're free to go, sir." The word "sir" came too late. He rubbed his wrist once, not to soothe the ache, but to mark the moment. The gesture felt ritualistic, almost judicial. "Next time," the officer added awkwardly, "just cooperate sooner. You never know how these things can look." Cross looked at him then, really looked. His eyes were still, cold, unsmiling. "I know exactly how they look." He took back his badge, brushed off a smear of oil, and pinned it to his jacket. The metal gleamed beneath the uncertain light. He turned without hurry, got into his car, and closed the door. The sound was soft, final. For a moment he sat there, hands on the steering wheel, the faint smell of gasoline clinging to his sleeves. Through the windshield, the officers were silhouettes framed by artificial blue, guardians of an order that could not see him unless he was subdued. He started the engine. The radio in his car came on quietly, classical music, restrained and exacting, the kind that never raised its voice. As he drove off, the gas station shrank into darkness again, the flickering light over pump 4 continuing its relentless hum, truth. Flickering, refusing to die out completely. Tomorrow, he would wear the robe. Tomorrow he would sit where judgment was no longer aimed at him but issued through him. But tonight, under the indifferent light of authority, the balance of power had already revealed its face. The holding room smelled of metal and disinfectant, an odor that did not belong to any one thing but to the institution itself. The walls were off-white, the kind that turned gray under fluorescent light. Everything inside was meant to be wiped clean: memory, accountability, the residue of names. Nathaniel Cross sat on a metal bench bolted to the wall. His wrists were free now, but the faint pressure where the cuffs had been lingered like a bruise in the air more than on the skin. His suit jacket was folded neatly beside him, creased but composed. The ID badge lay hidden in its pocket, concealed by fabric, as though to spare the room its shame. Above him a security camera tilted down at a subtle angle, silent, patient, omniscient. It blinked once, a red dot flashing in rhythm with the clock on the far wall. Tick. Red, tick, red, institutional time. Precise, endless, without empathy. The booking officer sat behind a glass barrier typing into a screen. The keyboard clicks punctuated the silence like small confessions. "Name?" he asked, though it was already written on the sheet in front of him. Nathaniel Cross. Date of birth? He gave it. Occupation? A pause. "Judge." The typing stopped. A single key hung in midair before resuming. "Judge," the officer repeated, less as acknowledgement and more as disbelief. Okay, he didn't look up. He didn't have to. The system didn't require faces, only fields to fill, boxes to check, names to neutralize. Another officer entered, young, restless, leaning on the counter. "That the guy from the gas station?" "Yeah, what's he doing here?" "He didn't do anything." "Procedural hold," the first replied. "Chief's orders." The young one looked at Cross, curiosity edging into unease. Cross met his eyes briefly, then looked away. The gaze was enough. There was something in that calm, deliberate stillness that made the young officer straighten. The printer whirred, a slow, mechanical exhale. Papers slid out, crisp and identical. The first officer stamped them without reading. Each thud was a small erasure, fingerprints next. Cross stood when instructed. The machine was small and impersonal, glass cold beneath his skin. The officer guided his hand with gloved fingers, pressing, rolling, releasing. It felt less like documentation than disassembly, turning a man into a series of ridges, an identity flattened into data. "Left index," the officer said. Cross complied. When it was over, he wiped his hands with the offered towel, slow and methodical. He placed it neatly on the counter afterward. "Sit tight," the officer said. "We'll sort this out." Cross sat again. The clock ticked louder now, or perhaps the silence had grown deeper around it. The red light on the camera blinked in counterpoint, its rhythm perfectly indifferent. A vending machine hummed in the corner. Someone laughed faintly from another room, a sound without context, a reminder that normalcy continued elsewhere. Cross stared at his shoes. Polished leather, faint scuff on the right toe. He remembered shining them that morning before leaving for court. Small rituals of order, of self-respect. Here, under this light, they looked foreign. Symbols of a world that had momentarily forgotten him. An older sergeant walked in, the kind who had seen too much and learned nothing from it. "You the one we picked up?" he asked. voice carrying the lazy authority of routine. Cross didn't answer. The sergeant smirked. Silent type, huh? Fine by me. Makes the paperwork easier. He turned to the booking officer. What's the story? Wrong ID on the dispatch. No charges. He's clean. Clean, the sergeant repeated. Lucky him. He turned to leave, but something in the posture of the man sitting there, still, silent, unbowed, made him pause. You a lawyer or something? Cross met his gaze evenly. Something like that. The sergeant nodded, a faint sneer playing at the edge of his mouth. Yeah, thought so. When he left, the door shut with a soft hydraulic hiss, sealing the room again. Cross's eyes returned to the clock. The minute hand trembled slightly with each shift. Time here was not movement. It was suspension, each second stretched, elongated, stripped of purpose. He could feel the system trying to make him small, to compress him into compliance through monotony. But silence, he knew, could outlast even institutional time. He sat that way for nearly an hour. Officers came and went. Forms changed hands. No one addressed him directly. He became, for them, part of the furniture, an object occupying space not demanding it. When they finally came to release him, there were no words of apology. Only a form slid through a slot and a muttered, "Sign here." He read the paper. Temporary detainment, mistaken identity. No charges filed. He signed with a controlled hand. Each letter perfect, deliberate, unshaken. The officer opened the door to let him out. You can go. Cross stood, adjusted his cuffs, and picked up his jacket. He looked once at the chair he'd been sitting on. The faint impression of his posture still pressed into its hard plastic. Keep your head down next time, the officer said. Without irony, Cross paused in the doorway. That's never been my problem. He stepped out into the corridor, the hum of fluorescent lights following him. The camera above the door turned slightly, tracking his exit. A final act of surveillance disguised as procedure. Outside, the hall stretched long and sterile, lined with identical doors. Each one could have been his. Each one could still be. He walked slowly, the click of his shoes echoing off the tile. The sound was steady, dignified, deliberate, the one thing the system had not stripped from him. The clock inside kept ticking. The red light kept blinking. The silence he left behind became its own kind of testimony. It was almost 4 a.m. when they told him he could leave. The words came without ceremony, passed across the counter like a receipt. You're free to go. Freedom, as they said it, sounded procedural. Nathaniel Cross stood for a moment, letting the statement sit in the air like something he might have to sign for. The officer on duty avoided his eyes, sliding a clipboard toward him with a pen chained to it. There was no apology, just an expectation that the transaction should feel sufficient. He signed his name again, each letter pressed with restraint, not anger. His signature filled the line with perfect order. Beneath it, the printed words, "Released without charge." He placed the pen back carefully, aligning it with the clipboard's edge before stepping back. Sorry about the mix-up, the officer muttered. His tone was empty, almost annoyed by the need to say it. Cross nodded once, nothing more. To acknowledge too much would give the apology weight it didn't deserve. The hallway beyond the counter was long, sterile, and too bright. It carried the kind of light that exposed rather than guided. His shoes clicked across the tiles, steady and precise. The same shoes from the night before, still carrying the faint scent of gasoline and something colder, humiliation disguised as procedure. He passed another officer at the end of the corridor, a young man sipping coffee from a paper cup. The man glanced up, recognized the face from earlier, and looked away quickly, pretending to study a notice board. The avoidance was almost tender, as if shame itself required privacy. The exit door loomed ahead, marked by a green sign that hummed faintly in the fluorescent light. When he pushed it open, the outside air struck him, a dense, early-morning fog settling over the parking lot. The city was still asleep, its noise subdued. Only the buzz of a distant street lamp broke the quiet. Cross paused at the threshold. For a moment, he didn't move. The cool air carried a thin mist that softened everything, edges, shapes, intentions. It was the kind of light that suggested renewal but offered none. He walked to his car. The sedan sat exactly where they had left it, parked under a tilted security camera. Dew had gathered on the windshield, beating along the glass like punctuation marks. His reflection in the driver's window was pale, fractured by droplets. He unlocked the door and sat inside. The leather seat was cold. His badge lay in the passenger seat where he had placed it hours ago, still faintly smeared with someone else's fingerprint. He stared at it for a long moment before pinning it back onto his lapel, the motion deliberate, like closing a wound. The engine started with a quiet hum. The headlights sliced through the fog, forming narrow corridors of visibility that seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. He checked the rear-view mirror. The station building stood behind him, gray and unremarkable, its windows glowing with bureaucratic indifference. For a brief second, he thought he saw movement, a figure at the entrance watching him, but when he blinked, the doorway was empty. He shifted into drive and pulled away slowly. The streets were empty. Traffic lights blinked on cycle, governing no one. Billboards flickered in the mist, advertisements for credit cards, security systems, city pride. Their slogans promised order, safety, trust. Cross drove through them all, the words dissolving against the windshield. His hands rested loosely on the steering wheel. His knuckles were pale, but not from fear, from control. Every motion was exact, measured to the inch. At an intersection, he stopped even though the light was green. The fog ahead thickened, swallowing the road. He could hear the faint rumble of an approaching delivery truck somewhere beyond it. For a moment, the world felt suspended. No sound, no movement. Just the weight of breath and recollection. He thought of the officer's face when the cuffs clicked shut, the casual authority, the bored certainty. He remembered the light from the gas station, its uneven pulse reflecting off the metal as though the universe itself had blinked. He did not think of revenge. That would have required emotion. What he felt was colder, comprehension. The clarity of seeing a system operate exactly as designed. He exhaled and drove on. At the next red light, he glanced again at the rear-view mirror. His own eyes looked back at him, tired, unblinking, as if asking whether dignity still meant anything when unseen. The mirror trembled faintly as the car idled. He adjusted it, restoring perfect symmetry. The act steadied him. Reflection and control, his only forms of protest now. The city began to wake around him. A bakery truck passed on the opposite side, headlights low and yellow. Somewhere nearby, a bus engine started coughing through the fog. The horizon bled faint light, gray turning silver, then a faint counterfeit gold. Dawn was coming. But dawn was not deliverance. He parked outside his building just as the sky began to lighten. The world was reassembling itself, pretending nothing had happened. Streetlights dimmed on schedule. Birds called without irony. Cross sat in the car a while longer. He could feel the stiffness in his shoulders, the weight in his hands. He didn't reach for his phone. There was no one to call, no version of the story that wouldn't diminish it in the telling. He looked at himself once more in the mirror. The man looking back seemed older than the one who had left home the night before. Same suit, same eyes, but stripped of something he hadn't known he'd been carrying until it was taken. When he finally stepped out, the cold air clung to him. The building's entrance light flickered once, then steadied. He ascended the steps, shoes tapping quietly against the concrete. At the door, he hesitated. The key felt heavier than it should. Inside, the clock in his living room ticked faintly, a gentler rhythm than the one at the station, but time all the same. He removed his jacket, hung it neatly, and placed the ID badge on the entry table. The metal gleamed faintly in the dim light, a symbol reclaimed yet contaminated. He didn't turn on the television or check the news. He poured a glass of water, stood by the window, and watched the fog thin into daylight. There was no speech to rehearse, no story to correct. The world would continue as it always had, indifferent, procedural, precise, and yet, beneath that precision, something irreversible had shifted. When the sun finally broke the horizon, it did so without warmth, just light, clinical and exact, washing over the city like an audit. Cross stood there a long while, eyes open, waiting for the day to begin as if it had earned the right to. Morning came without permission. The light that entered Nathaniel Cross's apartment was thin, gray, and deliberate, an institutional kind of daylight, the color of paper left too long in a file drawer. It seeped through the blinds rather than shone, indifferent to the hour or the man standing beneath it. Cross stood in front of the bathroom mirror, shirt buttoned, tie drawn tight. The man who looked back at him could have been a portrait, composed, complete, and quietly unreadable. But the mirror always knew better. Mirrors held the residue of the night before, no matter how perfectly one dressed for morning. He examined his reflection as though it were evidence. The faint redness around his wrists had faded but not disappeared. He turned his hands palm up, then down again, testing movement, measuring distance. The mirror offered no comfort, only accuracy. On the counter beside him, a single cufflink glimmered in the light, a small circle of silver, polished to reflection. He fastened it with precision. Ritual required order. Order demanded repetition. The clock in the hall ticked with judicial authority. Each second pressed him forward, not by force but by inevitability. He moved to the bedroom closet. Inside, hanging alone at the center like an artifact, was the robe. Black, heavy. The fabric caught the light differently from ordinary clothing. It absorbed it, refused to gleam. It was a garment built not for the man but for the institution. Whoever wore it became its silhouette. Cross reached out and touched the fabric, fingers pausing at the seam. The texture was familiar, comforting, but today it carried weight beyond its cloth. He remembered the feel of a different uniform, the gloves, the belt, the hand on his shoulder pressing him against cold metal. Power had many fabrics. He took the robe down carefully, folding it once over his arm. For a moment he stood still, the garment draped across him like a question. Then slowly he placed it on the bed and began to dress. Each motion was deliberate, precise. He did not hurry. To dress as a judge was not to prepare for work. It was to assume a posture, to construct a presence. The act was devotional but not religious. It was faith in order, even after seeing what order could do. When he finally slipped the robe over his shoulders, it fell with the weight of memory. The hem brushed his shoes. The air seemed to change temperature around him. He looked in the mirror again. The man who stared back was divided. The civilian beneath, the authority above. His collar was hidden now, his suit erased. Only the face remained, suspended above the dark cloth like a verdict still forming. He adjusted the sleeves, tugged once at the neckline, then stopped. It was heavier than he remembered. Not in fabric, but in meaning. For the first time in his career, he felt the robe's contradiction. Not protection, but burden. It concealed the body, yes, but it also demanded that the body disappear. He stood there, studying himself, until the clock announced it was time to leave. The drive to the courthouse was silent. The city had awakened into motion, the fog thinning to reveal a landscape that looked cleaner than it was. Pedestrians hurried along sidewalks, their faces lit by phone screens. Traffic lights rotated in colorless routine. The world, as always, had reset itself overnight. Cross kept his eyes on the road. Every intersection felt procedural, every stoplight a ritual of submission and permission. He obeyed them all. When he parked in the reserved lot behind the courthouse, he cut the engine and let his hands rest on the steering wheel for a moment. The leather still carried a faint scent of gasoline. He thought briefly of the station, the ticking clock, the red light, the officer's voice saying, "You're free to go." The words replayed not as memory, but as evidence, a testimony with no audience. He took a slow breath and exhaled. Then he reached for his briefcase and stepped out. Inside, the courthouse was its usual self. Cold marble, echoing corridors, portraits of predecessors in dignified stillness. Authority lived here in architecture. Even silence had acoustics. He moved through security. The guard nodded, almost bowing. The metal detector beeped for someone else, never for him. Power recognized power in this space, at least superficially. As he walked toward his chambers, a clerk hurried to meet him. "Good morning, Judge Cross," he nodded. "Morning," she offered a file, neatly clipped and labeled. "Today's docket. There's a disciplinary hearing added at 10. 2 officers. Unlawful detainment. Short case, procedural." Her words settled somewhere deep like a dropped coin hitting stone. "Thank you," he said, taking the file. She moved on. He didn't open it. Not yet. He carried it to his chambers and set it on the desk beside the gavel, the scales, and the framed oath that hung on the wall. To administer justice without respect to persons, and do equal right to the poor and to the rich. He looked at that sentence longer than usual. Each word sat balanced on its own promise, untouched by the tremors of the world outside. He removed the robe and draped it across the chair, smoothing the fabric with the palm of his hand. The texture was cool against his skin. He traced the seam with his thumb, an unconscious motion, like reading Braille for truth. Then he sat down, opened the file, and saw the names. 2 officers. The air in the room thinned, almost imperceptibly. He read the report once, quickly, then again, slower. The phrasing was bureaucratic. Phrases like detainment for questioning, subject uncooperative, released without incident. There was no mention of humiliation, of the trembling light, of the silence that had spoken louder than protest. He closed the folder. The clock on his wall ticked quietly, steady as a heartbeat. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the robe draped across the seat opposite him. It looked like a shadow waiting for a body. He thought of the mirror that morning, the man beneath, the man above, and realized there was no difference now. Both versions would sit in judgment today. He rose, reached for the robe again, and held it up to the light. The black fabric absorbed it entirely, reflecting nothing. He put it on, slowly, reverently. And as the cloth settled around him, it was no longer just a symbol of office. It was evidence of what power could conceal and of what it could restore. He looked once more in the mirror before leaving his chambers. The reflection met his gaze evenly, without accusation, without absolution. Then he turned away. Outside, the courtroom waited, sterile and silent, its benches empty for now. In a few minutes, the doors would open, the case would be called, and the system would face itself, unaware, perhaps, that the man in the robe had already seen its true reflection. He walked toward the bench with calm precision. Each step was measured, deliberate, soundless against the marble floor. When he reached the door, he paused, adjusted the robe, straightened his shoulders, and as the handle turned beneath his hand, the light from the corridor struck the black cloth, absorbing it completely, leaving only his face illuminated, still, and knowing. The file sat on the desk like a sealed truth. Judge Nathaniel Cross did not touch it at first. He stared at it, the manila folder, the metal clasp, the small printed label across the top. Hearing, Internal Affairs, Verse Officers D. Mercer and R. Harlan. Names were data until memory gave them weight. The office was still. The morning hum of the courthouse had settled into its usual rhythm, clerks whispering through hallways, typewriters ticking faintly, the measured footsteps of law clerks moving case to case. Cross's chambers, by contrast, felt insulated from sound. Authority required silence, and silence here was absolute. He opened the file. The first page was standard. Complaint summary, departmental language sterilized by repetition. Subject detained for identification mismatch. Subject released without incident. Procedural error acknowledged. He turned the page. Photocopies of forms, arrest log, witness notes, chain of custody receipts, timestamps. His eyes moved down the lines, slow, detached, the way one reads autopsy notes when the outcome is already known. Then he saw the signatures. Officer Daniel Mercer. Officer Ryan Harlan. The names glowed faintly in the sterile light. A stillness took root in him, not shock, not rage. Something colder, a recognition too precise to be emotional. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath the robe. For a moment he closed the file, his hand resting on the cover. The paper was warm beneath his palm, as though it retained the body heat of everyone who had touched it before him. He could feel the system breathing through it, forms layered on forms, ink sealing accountability into abstraction. He lifted his hand, reached for his pen. It was a black Mont Blanc, a gift from the Chief Justice 5 years earlier. A pen for verdicts, for signatures that shaped consequences. He turned it between his fingers, feeling its weight. The same fingers that had been pressed into the booking counter just hours before. The symmetry was obscene. He clicked the pen once, the sound sharp in the silence. It was both preparation and restraint. The act of writing had always meant control. But now it felt like the trigger of something larger, moral, procedural, inevitable. He reopened the file. The photographs were next, still frames from the station's security cameras. Low resolution, grainy, the angle wide and impersonal. He saw himself, a man in a dark suit, standing beside a car. 2 officers, one speaking, one stepping closer. The images lacked sound, but memory filled it in. The command, the tone, the click of metal. He looked at his own stillness. The posture of someone who had known exactly when words would no longer matter. He turned the photo over. Blank on the back. No caption. No acknowledgement. Just evidence that required no belief. He placed it face down and stared at the remaining pages. Statements. Summaries. None of them lies. Not exactly. Just omissions rearranged into order. Subject complied. No force necessary. Situation de-escalated. The language of absolution. Cross leaned forward. Elbows on the desk, hands folded beneath his chin. His eyes closed briefly. He remembered the station's clock ticking above him. The sound of the pen scratching as he signed the release form. The faint chemical smell of antiseptic that filled the air. He remembered the officer's voice, flat, indifferent, saying, "You're free to go." Freedom, it turned out, was a line item. He opened his eyes. The file still waited. He turned one more page and found the final note from Internal Affairs. Hearing scheduled for review. Recommended disposition. Written reprimand. That word, reprimand, hung in the air like a smirk. He reached for the pen again and set its tip against the margin. Not writing, just holding it there. Ink pressed against paper, waiting. The robe felt heavier now, the collar pulling slightly at the back of his neck. Its fabric carried the faint scent of starch and dust, courtroom scent, institutional permanence. He adjusted it with a slow movement, grounding himself in the ritual. Someone knocked softly at the door. "Come in," he said, voice calm. His clerk entered, hesitant. "Judge Cross, the hearing's at 10. Do you want me to prepare the docket?" "Yes. Do you—" "Want a moment before they arrive?" Cross looked up. The clerk was young, early 20s, nervous, unsure when silence meant dismissal. "No," he said quietly. "Let's proceed as scheduled." The clerk nodded and left. Cross sat back again. The pen rolled slightly across the desk before stopping against the edge of the file. He watched it settle. The act of judgment was supposed to be impersonal. Detachment was a virtue in this role. But today, detachment had teeth. It bit through the boundary between judge and man. He rose from his chair and crossed to the window. The city below moved with bureaucratic precision. Taxis aligning at lights, pedestrians crossing in measured rhythm, the courthouse flag rising on its pulley. Everything in motion, everything contained. He thought of the two officers walking through the same fog he had left hours earlier. They would enter the courthouse believing this was another procedural inconvenience. They would not expect the face behind the bench. That thought did not comfort him. It burdened him further. He turned back to the desk. The file waited. The pen waited. He sat again and began to write. Not a ruling, not yet, but notes. Facts first. Always facts. Case, Mercer and Harlan. Complaint, unlawful detention. Context, procedural misconduct. Subject, he stopped. The next word would have been his own name. He drew a line through it. Left it blank. The ink bled slightly into the paper, dark and final. When he was finished, he placed the pen down carefully, parallel to the folder's edge. The room felt smaller now, air thick with the quiet gravity of what awaited. He reached for the file, closed it again, and pressed his palm flat against the cover. The gesture was involuntary, like closing a wound to stop the bleeding. Outside, the courthouse bell struck 9. 1 hour. He looked toward the door, where light from the corridor spilled in a narrow line across the floor. It reached only halfway to the desk, then stopped. As if uncertain whether to cross the boundary, the system was preparing to face itself. And in that measured stillness, Nathaniel Cross understood. Justice was never blind. It simply refused to look in certain directions until forced to. He straightened the file, smoothed the robe, and rose. The clock on the wall marked the moment. Each tick sounded like a verdict being written somewhere beyond his control. He picked up the pen one last time, slipped it into his pocket, and turned toward the door. When he stepped into the corridor, the light swallowed him whole. The file remained on the desk, closed, waiting. Inside it, ink and paper whispered the shape of truth, one that could not yet be spoken, but soon would be. The hearing room was small, rectangular, and overlit. The kind of space built not for justice, but for procedure. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead in a perfect, ceaseless pitch. The sound of bureaucracy breathing. The air was too clean, too dry. Authority liked its rooms sterile. Judge Nathaniel Cross sat at the bench. The robe draped over him like shadow incarnate, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Before him, the file rested neatly on the desk, closed. The pen lay parallel to its edge. Everything aligned. The bailiff called the hearing to order. Internal Affairs Review, docket 17-63, Mercer and Harlan. 2 men rose. Daniel Mercer was the first. Broad shoulders, a jaw built for command, hair trimmed with military precision. His badge was absent today, replaced by a navy suit that tried too hard to convey humility. Ryan Harlan stood beside him, younger, eyes darting between the floor and the judge's face without landing on either. Their lawyer, a department-appointed representative, sat with a file of his own, the papers within arranged like shields. They did not recognize him. "Not yet. Good morning, Your Honor," the lawyer said. His voice was smooth, bureaucratically calm. "We appreciate the court's time for what we expect will be a brief and straightforward review." Cross nodded once. His hands rested on the table before him, palms down, fingers aligned. He said nothing. The lawyer continued. "Officers Mercer and Harlan acknowledge the error made during the course of their patrol. The incident in question occurred late at night, under limited visibility, and was—" He paused, consulting the file. "An understandable misjudgment. The officers acted in good faith." Good faith. The phrase settled like dust in the air, imperceptible, but suffocating all the same. Cross's eyes lowered to the file before him. He did not open it. He already knew every word inside. Mercer shifted in his seat, shoulders straightening. His posture was defensive even in stillness, chin up, back rigid, the unconscious stance of someone who believed authority was an inherited right. Harlan, by contrast, kept his head bowed slightly, hands clasped too tightly. Cross studied them without expression. The stillness of his face was deliberate, a mirror in which others revealed themselves. The lawyer's words continued to fill the space, looping through protocol. "Our clients have exemplary records, multiple commendations, and no prior disciplinary actions. We ask the court to consider this incident in its proper context. A brief lapse in procedural adherence, already addressed internally." Cross's voice, when it came, was calm but sharp-edged. "Addressed how?" The lawyer blinked. "Sir? Already addressed internally. Explain." The man cleared his throat. "Written advisement, Your Honor. Both officers have received counseling and retraining sessions as part of the department's standard corrective measures." "Retraining, yes." "Your Honor," Cross let the word hang. The hum of the fluorescent light filled the pause. Mercer glanced up now, finally meeting the judge's gaze. Their eyes locked. A flash of uncertainty, confusion, something searching for familiarity and not finding it. Cross spoke again, his tone precise. "The record refers to an unlawful detainment. Do the officers dispute that classification?" The lawyer interjected. "We maintain that the detainment, while technically non-compliant, was conducted under reasonable suspicion. The subject fit the general description of a suspect in the area." "The general description," Cross repeated. "Yes, Your Honor." "Describe it." The lawyer hesitated. "Male, dark clothing, approximately 6 feet tall." Cross leaned forward slightly. "And what made that description distinct from a dozen others who might have fit it?" Silence. Mercer shifted. His throat moved as he swallowed, but no sound followed. Harlan's hands clenched tighter. Cross waited. The silence expanded, filling the sterile room with pressure. It wasn't absence of sound. It was a presence of discomfort. "Your Honor," the lawyer began. "This line of questioning seems—" Cross raised a hand. The motion was small but final. "Proceed." The lawyer's protest died mid-word. Cross turned his attention to the officers. "You detained a man at a gas station. You asked for identification. He provided it. You handcuffed him regardless. Is that accurate?" Mercer cleared his throat. "He was uncooperative. In what way?" "He questioned the order to step away from his vehicle. Was that unlawful?" Mercer hesitated. "No, sir." "Then what was the justification for escalation?" Mercer's voice tightened. "Officer safety." That phrase, 2 words that erased accountability, filled the air like static. Cross regarded him steadily. "Did you feel unsafe?" Mercer straightened. It was late. He matched the description. "We followed protocol." Cross's tone remained even. "Protocol requires probable cause." Did you have it? Mercer's jaw clenched. We believed. Belief, Cross said quietly, is not the same as cause. The words landed like the first strike of a gavel. Though he hadn't touched it yet, Harlan's eyes flicked to the judge's hands. His expression shifted, uncertainty sharpening into recognition. His posture changed subtly, shoulders drawing inward. Mercer followed his gaze. The realization came slower for him, but when it arrived, it froze him mid-breath. Cross saw it happen. The exact instant when comprehension met guilt. He did not move. He let them see him fully now, not just the robe, but the man within it. The stillness of his gaze carried more weight than accusation. Mercer spoke first, voice unsteady. Your Honor, were you— Cross cut him off. This hearing is not about me, officer. Silence again. The hum of the light grew louder, the sound almost electrical. The lawyer's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering softly against the table. No one moved to pick it up. Cross leaned back. His hand rested near the gavel but did not touch it. The symbol of judgment waited, inert. Even silence could be a sentence. He spoke, voice low, steady. You speak of good faith, of retraining, of misunderstanding. But what occurred that night was neither error nor confusion. It was certainty. You were certain of your authority, and equally certain of his guilt. The mistake was not procedural. It was moral. No one breathed. Cross's words continued, measured as a pulse. A written reprimand cannot correct that kind of failure. Training cannot teach sight to eyes that refuse to see. Mercer shifted, looking down. Harlan's face was pale. The lawyer looked like a man who wished the room itself could close around him. Cross reached for the gavel, lifted it, then stopped halfway. He set it down gently. The sound was soft but final. He looked to the clerk. Record this. Finding deferred. Hearing adjourned pending further review. The clerk nodded, hands trembling slightly as she typed. Cross rose. The robe moved with him, the folds heavy, deliberate. The officers stood too, instinctively, their posture now uncertain, authority reversed but not yet comprehended. He stepped away from the bench. Your Honor, the lawyer called, hesitant. May I ask what the court intends to— You may not, Cross said. His tone carried no anger, only exhaustion. The record will speak before I do. He walked past them. As he passed Mercer, the officer's eyes flicked upward, searching for absolution. None came. The door closed behind him with a sound that echoed longer than it should have. Outside, the hallway stretched empty. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly above. He paused at the end of it, standing perfectly still. Inside the chamber, the gavel lay untouched on the bench, a small object of power that, for once, had refused to make noise. In its silence, judgment had already been rendered. The court recorder clicked on, a red light winking once before steadying into a silent, unblinking stare. Judge Nathaniel Cross adjusted the papers before him. The pages made no sound when moved, thin, dry, institutional paper, the kind that carried truth only when forced to. His pen lay across the top page, black and sleek, the weight of it a metronome against restraint. Across from him, the two officers sat side by side. Mercer on the left, rigid, defensive, his posture a shield. Harlan on the right, tense but smaller somehow, as though trying to vanish into the chair. Between them, a gulf of silence that neither dared to fill. The fluorescent lights hummed above, steady as pulse. Cross spoke first. His voice was calm, precise. Officer Mercer, walk me through your decision-making process that evening. Mercer straightened. Your Honor, we were conducting a routine patrol. We saw a man refueling his car at an unusual hour. The station had reported suspicious activity the week before. We approached for questioning. Suspicious activity, Cross repeated, and this individual fit your description of a potential suspect. Yes, sir. He matched the general profile, male, mid-40s, African-American, dark sedan. Did you run his plates? No, Your Honor, not until after the interaction began. Cross's pen tapped once against the paper. Tap, a rhythm of thought, not impatience. The sound filled the silence left by Mercer's answer, echoing faintly in the still room. So before confirming any information, you engaged directly, Cross said. Yes, sir. You ordered him to step away from his vehicle. Mercer hesitated. Correct. Did he comply? He hesitated. Cross looked up. Hesitation is not refusal, officer. Mercer's mouth opened, then closed again. The hum of the lights deepened in the pause. Cross continued. At what point did you decide to handcuff him? When he questioned our request. Questioned, Cross repeated softly. What were his exact words? Mercer's voice faltered. He said, I haven't done anything wrong. And that constituted grounds for restraint? Mercer looked down at his hands. They rested on the table, fingers interlaced too tightly. The tendons in his wrists showed pale against the skin. Cross waited, pen resting between his fingers. Tap. The sound drew Mercer's gaze upward again. It was a tense situation, he said. We didn't know if he was armed. Did you search him? Yes. Find anything? No, sir. Cross leaned slightly forward, the robe settling around him like darkness gathering weight. So, a man questioned your authority and your response was to assert it physically. Is that an accurate summary? Mercer's eyes flicked toward the lawyer, then back. Your Honor, it wasn't like that. Then describe it accurately. Mercer hesitated again. We acted on instinct. Cross's pen tapped once, twice, tap, tap. He shifted his attention to Harlan. Officer Harlan, when did you realize the man you detained was not a suspect? Harlan swallowed. After checking his ID, sir. How long after the handcuffs were applied? Maybe a minute. 2 at most. And yet, he remained restrained for 20 minutes. Harlan's eyes darted downward. We were waiting for confirmation from dispatch. Confirmation of what? That he wasn't who we thought. Cross nodded slowly. So the absence of guilt required verification. Harlan said nothing. The silence between them expanded again, thick, moral, almost physical. Cross let it live. It filled the space with truth no testimony could articulate. Finally he spoke. Did either of you apologize to the man? Mercer looked away. We told him he was free to go. That isn't an apology. Harlan's voice came quiet. No, sir, we didn't. Cross studied him. Harlan's hands were trembling slightly now, fingertips pressing against one another in nervous rhythm. Mercer noticed, frowned, then stilled his own by gripping the edge of the table. Power preserved through posture. Cross saw everything. The eyes, the hands, the way words shaped guilt before verdict. He returned his gaze to the file. The inked words inside looked almost harmless now. Typed text had no conscience. Officer Mercer, he said, when you handcuffed the man, what did you feel? Mercer frowned. Feel, sir? Yes, not what you thought. What you felt. Mercer hesitated. I don't know. Routine, I guess. Routine. Cross's voice was almost whisper now. Is that what dignity feels like when taken from someone else? Mercer's mouth opened, but no words came. Cross's pen tapped again, softer now. Tap. The sound landed like judgment disguised as rhythm. He turned to Harlan. And you? Harlan's voice was small. I felt uneasy, sir. It didn't feel right. Did you say anything? No, sir. Why not? Harlan hesitated. Because he was my partner. Cross looked at him for a long time. And silence, officer, is sometimes the loudest agreement of all. Harlan blinked hard. Mercer looked straight ahead, face blank, but a flicker of color rose along his neck. Cross's tone softened, though not kindly. Tell me, when you filled out the report afterward, who wrote the line, subject uncooperative? Mercer spoke quietly. I did. Did he resist? No, sir. Then why that phrasing? Because... Mercer trailed off. Because it's standard. Standard, Cross echoed. Language designed to protect you from accountability. Mercer said nothing. Cross let the silence take hold once more. The hum of the fluorescent lights became deafening. Even the pen seemed to listen now, still between his fingers. Gentlemen, Cross said finally, his tone level, deliberate. The institution you serve demands obedience, yes, but not blindness. There is a difference between procedure and conscience. One maintains order, the other maintains humanity. When you confuse the two, you do harm not only to others, but to the very uniform you wear. Neither man moved. Cross continued, his words cutting with surgical calm. I am not here to humiliate you. I am here to remind you what your oath means. You swore to protect the innocent. You did not ask first what they looked like. Harlan's breathing had quickened slightly, shallow and uneven. Mercer's jaw flexed, a muscle tightening against shame. Cross drew a line on the paper before him. One deliberate stroke, ink straight and final. Not a note, a mark of closure. He looked up. Is there anything either of you would like to add to the record? Neither answered. Very well, he said softly. Then the record will stand as it is, silent where truth should have spoken. He capped his pen, the click of metal precise, controlled. The sound echoed faintly through the chamber. He rose from his seat. The robe moved as he did, slow and deliberate, folds catching the sterile light. "Officers," he said, voice even, "you are dismissed." They stood, mechanically, uncertainly, and walked out. The sound of their shoes against the tile was the only thing left alive in the room. When the door closed, Cross remained still. The hum of the lights returned to dominance. The pen rested near his hand, motionless. He exhaled once, deeply. The silence afterward felt heavier than any verdict. For a long time, he did not move. His eyes drifted to the empty chairs where they had sat, the space still holding the outline of their guilt. Then slowly, he lifted the pen again and began to write. Not testimony this time, but truth. Each word came measured, clean, irreversible. The courtroom emptied slowly as though sound itself had grown cautious. Chairs slid against the tile in muted surrender. Papers rustled, a few muffled coughs punctured the hush, and then nothing. Judge Nathaniel Cross remained seated. His hands rested flat on the bench, palms open, motionless. He could hear the air move, the faint whisper of the ventilation system, the low hum of the lights that had presided over the testimonies. Everything else was still. He did not rise until the last echo of footsteps faded from the corridor. When he finally stood, the robe's fabric shifted against him with a subtle drag, cloth heavy with authority, heavier still with memory. He reached for the gavel but didn't lift it. His reflection glimmered faintly in the polished surface of the bench, warped, uncertain, as though the wood itself refused clarity. He turned, walking toward the door leading to his chambers. The handle was cool, stainless steel, indifferent. Inside, the air changed. Quieter, denser. The walls absorbed sound instead of carrying it. A clock ticked with deliberate rhythm, state-issued, unfeeling. Each second pressed forward, refusing to wait for conscience. Cross set the robe carefully on the back of the chair. Without it, the room felt larger, emptier. The robe's folds collapsed in on themselves, black fabric draping like something that had exhaled. He loosened his collar. The silence grew intimate, almost sentient. He sat down behind the desk, where a single file still lay open. The officers' names were printed in bold: Mercer, Harlan, simple typed letters, neither cruel nor repentant. He closed the file without reading further. The click of the folder snapping shut echoed louder than it should have. For several minutes he did nothing. The memory of the gas station returned, not as vision, but as pulse. The fluorescent light flickering above him, the smell of gasoline sharp in the air, the weight of unseen eyes, the gun that came up before his name did. That frozen moment, that fracture in time when identity vanished and only threat remained. It came back in flashes, not sentences. The command. The cuffs. The silence, he exhaled. His breath fogged faintly against the chill of the room, dispersing like thought. Across the chamber, the window blinds were half closed. Lines of daylight filtered through, measured and divided. The light fell in precise bands across the wall, cutting through shadow like judicial scripture. Filtered truth, controlled illumination. He watched the dust drift through it, small, weightless fragments moving without permission or destination. He thought of how many rooms like this existed across the country, identical, clinical, sanitized. Rooms where decisions were made in tones of certainty, while the world outside waited in confusion or anger. He pressed his palms together, fingertips aligned. A gesture of composure, not prayer. Silence, he realized, was both his burden and his rebellion. He could speak, issue the verdict, define the narrative, claim moral ground. But not yet. Words were too easily consumed by the machinery of explanation, too easily filed away until they lost meaning. Silence remained unrecorded. It could not be quoted, spun, or diluted. It could accuse without noise. He rose and walked to the window. The city beyond was subdued under pale afternoon light. Buildings stood in rigid geometry, indifferent witnesses to the endless repetition of justice. Somewhere beyond them, the gas station still existed. The same cracked pavement, the same hum of fluorescent lamps. He imagined it now, empty again. A space cleansed of conflict but not of memory. He closed his eyes. The sound of the ticking clock filled the distance between now and then. Tick, the pump handle dropping. Tick, the cold steel of the cuffs. Tick, the apology that never came. He opened his eyes again. The light through the blinds had shifted slightly, the bands moving up along the wall like time climbing out of reach. He returned to his chair and picked up the robe. The fabric was cool, smooth. He folded it carefully, slow, deliberate movements, each crease an act of containment. When he was done, he placed it neatly on the chair beside him. For the first time since the hearing began, the robe did not hang on him like authority. It lay instead like burden suspended, waiting to be worn again. He leaned back. His gaze drifted to the pen on the desk, the same one that had tapped rhythm through testimony, metronome of control. He turned it once between his fingers, then set it down. He realized he had not spoken in nearly an hour. No words, no notes, no decisions. Just the sound of breath and clock and conscience. And somehow that silence spoke louder than any verdict. It said, "I remember." It said, "I will not forget." It said, "The system does not absolve itself through ceremony." Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, brief, fading. Swallowed by the city's hum, Cross stood again, moving slowly toward the coat rack where his briefcase hung. His motions were precise, ritualistic. He placed the case on the desk and opened it, but did not take anything out. Instead, he looked at the folded robe one last time. The light from the blinds cut across it in stripes of gray and white, judgment and mercy, day and night. He touched the fabric lightly with one hand. "Not yet," he whispered. Then he sat back down and let the silence resume its reign. It was not peace. It was not closure. It was the waiting space between injustice and reckoning. The moment the world draws breath before the gavel falls, and somewhere deep inside that stillness, Judge Nathaniel Cross prepared himself to speak, not as a man wronged, but as the conscience of a system that had tried to forget his name. He closed his eyes, and the chamber, awash in muted light and suspended dust, held its breath with him. Tick. The courtroom was full again. The air felt different this time, thicker, charged, like the pause before a storm's first break. Rows of faces watched the bench in silence. Officers, attorneys, clerks, the public. No one spoke, though the room seemed to hum with expectation. Judge Nathaniel Cross entered without announcement. The bailiff's call, "All rise," rose and fell like ritual, but Cross's eyes stayed level, calm. His robe was draped perfectly, the fabric dark as judgment. He took his seat. The sound of the chair settling under him was the first noise that mattered. "Be seated," he said. The words came quiet, but absolute. The room obeyed instantly. Cross set the file before him. It was thin, too thin for the weight it carried. His hand rested atop it for a moment, fingers spread, as if measuring the distance between law and truth. "Officers Mercer and Harlan," he began, "you stand before this court charged with unlawful detention, misconduct, and abuse of authority. The facts have been heard. The record is complete." His tone was measured, each word shaped with judicial precision. But beneath that surface, something deeper vibrated, a controlled current of moral gravity. He looked up. Mercer sat rigid again, jaw set in that same defensive line. Harlan avoided his eyes entirely, gaze fixed somewhere near the floor. Their attorney whispered something to them, but they didn't respond. Cross continued. "The defense has argued that your actions were procedural, guided by instinct and concern for public safety. The prosecution has argued that they were unlawful, guided by bias and misuse of power. The court does not traffic in conjecture. It examines conduct." He paused. The silence extended, deliberate, heavy. He lifted the file, opened it, and read aloud. "At approximately 11:37 p.m. on the night in question, you detained an unarmed black man at a gas station without probable cause. You handcuffed him, searched his vehicle, and held him for 20 minutes after confirming his innocence." He set the papers down again. "That is not procedure. That is presumption." A faint murmur moved through the back row. Cross's eyes lifted slightly, just enough, and it died at once. He spoke again, quieter now. "Law, gentlemen, is not instinct. It is discipline. It does not ask for reflex, it demands restraint." The room was utterly still. He leaned forward. The lights above caught on the edge of his gavel. "In your testimony, you spoke often of routine. But the routine you described, the ease with which you reduced a citizen to a suspect, reveals the quiet rot of habit. Habit mistaken for duty. His voice sharpened, each word measured like a blade. And that is the most dangerous corruption of all, the one that calls itself normal. Mercer's hands were clasped tightly together now, the skin whitening at the knuckles. Harlan swallowed hard. Their lawyer stared at the table. Cross straightened. "Before I pronounce judgment, there is one final matter of record." He paused, letting the air settle around him. "The man you detained that night," he said, his tone now low, steady, "was me." No movement at first, only a visible tightening across Mercer's face, as though his mind had misheard the words. Harlan looked up too sharply, lips parting without sound. The lawyer froze. Cross continued, unwavering. "You did not know my name. You did not care to. You saw a man and decided what he must be. That night your judgment failed. And now, judgment returns." The courtroom seemed to contract around his voice. Every breath in the room synchronized and stopped. "I have not spoken until this moment of my involvement, because justice cannot begin in anger. It must stand on truth alone. But truth, once revealed, does not ask permission to exist." He glanced toward the court reporter. "Let the record show that full transparency has been declared. The integrity of this court remains intact." He turned back to the defendants. "Officer Mercer, Officer Harlan, the court finds you guilty of unlawful detention and misconduct. Your actions violated both constitutional rights and departmental ethics." He lifted the gavel, slowly, ceremonially. "This sentence is not born of vengeance. It is born of clarity." The gavel came down once. The sound cut through the air like a fracture in stone. In recognition of mitigating circumstances and the absence of physical harm, the court orders a suspension without pay, mandatory retraining, and public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. He looked directly at Mercer. "But understand this. Punishment is not the same as redemption. You will carry this verdict longer than its term, because what you did cannot be undone. It can only be understood." The officers sat motionless. Mercer's eyes flickered between shock and something colder, fear that no apology could bridge. Harlan looked as if the world had just tilted beneath him. Cross's gaze moved across the courtroom, sweeping the space like searchlight through smoke. "This hearing is adjourned." He struck the gavel once more. The echo lingered longer than sound should, reverberating through the walls, into the corridors, out into the world beyond. He remained seated as everyone began to rise. The shuffle of movement, the whisper of shoes, the cautious exhalations, it all passed around him, never touching him. When the last person had left, he sat alone again, the echo of the gavel still vibrating faintly in his bones. He looked at his hands. The same hands that had once been cuffed now rested upon the bench of justice. The transformation was not triumph. It was restoration. Outside, through the high courtroom windows, light poured in, sharp, unwavering. No longer filtered, Cross stood and removed his robe once more, folding it neatly. The fabric resisted slightly, holding its form before yielding. He placed it over his arm and descended from the bench. At the door, he paused. He looked back at the empty courtroom, the witness stand, the empty chairs, the lingering presence of judgment. The air seemed cleaner somehow, lighter, but not yet free. He thought of the gas station, the cold metal, the cuffs. He thought of the officers' faces when the truth broke them open. He thought of the echo of his own voice, calm, unshaken, whole. He turned off the lights. The room fell into shadow, leaving only the faint outline of the gavel on the bench, a small shape of authority resting in silence. As he stepped into the corridor, the last of the echo followed him out, dissolving into the hum of the building. The system had heard him now, and for the first time, it had to listen. The corridor was long, pale, and perfectly straight, designed for order, not humanity. The kind of hallway that muted footsteps, erased echoes, and encouraged people to move quickly, to not linger in what justice left behind. Judge Nathaniel Cross walked through it alone. The door to the courtroom closed behind him with a mechanical click, soft yet final. He didn't look back. The sound was enough. It marked the end of something, though whether it was an ending or a beginning, he couldn't tell. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed in even intervals, their glow sterile and unwavering. Each fixture reflected off the polished tile, casting twin lines that stretched ahead of him like measured paths through neutrality. A few clerks passed him in silence. One nodded politely too quickly. Another pretended to be absorbed in a file. No one met his eyes for long. In this building, avoidance was a kind of respect, or fear. Cross's robe hung folded over his arm, the weight of it balanced, deliberate. Without it, he looked smaller but somehow more dangerous, like truth stripped of its ceremony. At the far end of the corridor, a glass panel revealed a glimpse of the outside world. Gray sky, a flag barely stirring in the wind, city sounds kept politely at bay. Between him and that exit, the institution stretched on, offices, records, whispers. He walked slowly. Each step fell into rhythm with the light's faint electrical hum. It sounded almost like breathing, mechanical, endless, the sound of a system sustaining itself. He passed portraits on the wall. Former judges, all framed in dark wood, their expressions fixed in historical composure. They stared past him, indifferent. Centuries of solemnity, untouched by consequence. He wondered how many of them had ever been questioned, how many had ever sat cuffed under fluorescent light, waiting for an apology that never came. None, he thought. Not one. He reached the midpoint of the corridor. The air smelled faintly of polish and recycled air, clean but lifeless. A young intern rounded the corner ahead, saw him, and immediately lowered her gaze. She mumbled, "Your Honor," and moved aside, pressing her back lightly against the wall to give him space. Cross nodded once in acknowledgement but said nothing. Words, he'd learned, could dilute silence. At his chest, his ID badge swung gently with each step. The laminated plastic caught the light. Judge Nathaniel Cross. The same badge he'd worn the night of the arrest, clipped to the inside of his jacket pocket. The one they hadn't seen because they hadn't cared to look. He touched it briefly, his fingers brushing the cool surface. Identity reclaimed. Not as proof, but as resistance. He passed an open doorway, the clerk's office. Inside, conversation died mid-sentence. The quiet that followed was brittle, the kind that waited for him to be out of earshot before exhaling. He kept walking. The hallway curved slightly at the far end, toward the judge's lounge. A senior colleague emerged from the corner, Judge Alder, silver-haired, face lined with the self-assurance of tenure. He stopped when he saw Cross, offered a stiff nod. "Quite a morning," Alder said, tone clipped, impersonal. Cross met his gaze evenly. "Yes," Alder shifted his weight. "The board will want a statement, I imagine." "They'll have the transcript," Cross replied. Alder hesitated. "You made history today, Nathaniel." Cross didn't blink. "No," he said. "I corrected it." Alder's eyes flickered, just enough to register discomfort. "Still," he said quietly, "you've put the department in a difficult position." "The department," Cross repeated, voice steady, "put itself there." Alder inclined his head, a gesture that tried to be courteous and failed. "I suppose time will sort it out." "Time sorts nothing," Cross said. "People do." Alder offered a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Take care of yourself, Judge Cross." "I have been," Cross said. They passed one another. Neither looked back. The corridor resumed its silence, stretching before him like an unbroken sentence. He reached the window at the far end. The glass was clean, reflective. For a moment, he saw himself doubled in it, inside and outside, the judge and the man at the gas station. Two truths occupying one frame. Beyond the glass, daylight had brightened slightly, the city stirring in quiet motion. Cars glinted in the distance. Somewhere a siren wailed faintly. Familiar and far, Cross stood there a long time, hands at his sides, his reflection hovering over the world he both served and endured. He thought of what the officers might be doing now, sitting in a waiting room, processing shock, rehearsing explanations. He did not hate them. He did not forgive them either. The feeling was cleaner than that. Justice, when properly rendered, left no room for satisfaction. Only stillness. He turned from the window. The ID badge brushed lightly against his chest again. Its presence grounded him, not as title but as truth reclaimed. He began walking back the way he came. The corridor lights hummed above, sterile, continuous, indifferent. But beneath their hum, another rhythm lived now, softer, human, persistent. The sound of footsteps that did not yield, A janitor stepped aside to let him pass, eyes lowered, mop paused mid-stroke. Cross gave a brief nod of thanks. The man nodded back, eyes lingering a moment longer, curiosity mixed with recognition. When Cross reached the end of the hallway, he stopped before the door leading out to the judicial garage. The keypad beside it glowed faintly. He entered his code, the soft beep of each number loud in the quiet. The door clicked open. Before stepping through, he looked once more down the long stretch of the corridor, the empty space, the sterile light, the silence that institutions mistake for peace. He knew this hallway would remain exactly as it was tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Justice might speak for a moment, but the walls were built for endurance. Still, endurance was not invincibility. He touched his badge again, a small, deliberate gesture, claiming what had always been his. Then he walked through the door and into the light beyond. The corridor closing behind him with a soft, obedient sigh, the institution resumed its hum. But it would never sound quite the same again. The gas station hadn't changed. Same cracked pavement, same buzz of flickering fluorescent light, same smell of oil and rain-soaked concrete. The hum of the city beyond it was faint, distant enough to feel unreal, as if the rest of the world had been paused for this small, perpetual stage. Judge Nathaniel Cross parked his car by the far pump, engine cooling with slow clicks that faded into the night air. It was late again, nearly the same hour as before. The digital clock on his dashboard glowed 11:32. He stepped out quietly. The air was cold, thinner than memory. He could hear the light's intermittent flicker overhead, the tired buzz of the electric sign trying to hold its brightness. The ground beneath his shoes was still uneven. A faint dark stain marked the spot where gasoline had once spilled, a faint constellation of oil shining under artificial light. He stood there a long time, not moving. The same posture, the same silence. The difference was invisible but absolute. That night, the night, he had stood here as a man under suspicion. Now he stood as a judge who had rendered judgment. The system that had restrained him now served his hand, and yet it did not feel like victory. It felt like witnessing a circle close on itself, a machine returning to its idle hum. He looked around. The night clerk was inside the small glass booth, half asleep over a phone screen, oblivious. Across the lot, a stray cat moved through the shadows by the trash bins, sleek and silent. The pump light blinked again. Buzz, flicker, glow. Cross walked to it, his footsteps deliberate. He placed his hand on the cold metal handle, the same gesture that had begun everything. The metal was smooth, indifferent to history. For a moment he saw it again. The flash of blue, the shouts, the hands gripping his arms. The command, "Step away from the car." The snap of steel at his wrists. He remembered the eyes that had not seen him, the silence he had chosen instead of pleading. He exhaled slowly. He could almost measure the distance between that night and this one, not in miles, but in moral gravity. He glanced toward the convenience store window. His reflection stared back, distorted by glass, layered over shelves of cigarettes and candy. The robe was gone, replaced by a dark overcoat. Still the posture remained. Authority translated into bearing, not costume. He met his own eyes. The man in the reflection looked back with the same composure he had worn in court. But something beneath it had shifted, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that systems cannot repent, only repeat. He reached into his pocket and withdrew his ID badge. It caught the station light, glinting once before settling into shadow. Judge Nathaniel Cross. He turned it over in his hand, thumb brushing the raised lettering. The badge was plastic, easily broken, easily replaced, and yet it was the one proof the officers had never asked to see. He thought of them now, Mercer and Harlan. 2 names on a file, 2 men who had carried out a ritual so practiced it felt inevitable. He wondered if they had thought of him since the hearing, if they had lain awake hearing the echo of his voice in their silence. He didn't want them ruined, only aware. He slid the badge back into his pocket. The pump light above him flickered again, briefly plunging the lot into half-darkness before sputtering back to life. The brief moment of shadow made everything sharper. The shape of his car, the gleam of the pavement, the faint outline of the surveillance camera above the awning. He looked up at that camera. The lens glowed faintly red, unblinking. Somewhere the feed was being recorded. Another night, another image of a black man standing alone at a gas station. The system watching, documenting, misunderstanding. He smiled faintly, thin, tired. Still watching, he murmured. He stepped back toward the car. The sound of his shoes against the concrete echoed softly, rhythmic, the same cadence that had followed him through the courthouse corridor. He opened the car door, but didn't get in. Instead, he leaned against the frame and looked out across the lot again. The silence here was different than in court. It wasn't structured, reverent, or procedural. It was raw, ordinary silence, belonging to no one, answering to nothing. He realized he had come not for closure, but for confirmation. The world, indifferent and unchanged, remained the same. And yet by standing here again, unafraid, unbowed, he had altered the equation. He existed now as contradiction incarnate, the accused and the arbiter, the man silenced and the one whose word now carried the weight of law. His very presence in this system was proof of its imperfection and its possibility. He straightened, hands in his coat pockets. The gas station's hum filled the air like a mechanical heartbeat. He remembered something his father had told him once. Power doesn't change men. It shows who they've always been. He thought of that as he looked again at the pump light. Trembling on the edge of failure, but refusing to die. It was truth itself, flickering, fragile, but enduring. He looked up at the night sky. Between the clouds, a few stars managed to pierce through the haze of city light. Small, persistent points of clarity. He breathed in the cold air and exhaled slowly, letting it leave him completely. He did not speak. He did not need to. The silence itself had become his verdict. Behind him, the faint sound of tires approached, a car pulling into the lot. A young man stepped out, hoodie up, head down, reaching for his wallet as he moved toward the pump. Cross watched him for a moment. The boy looked up briefly, catching Cross's eye. They exchanged the smallest of nods, no words. Recognition without context. Cross turned, opened his car door fully, and sat down. The seat creaked, the engine hummed to life, headlights cutting across the concrete. He glanced once more in the rearview mirror. For a moment, the gas station filled the reflection. The pumps, the light, the young man, the watching camera. A portrait of repetition, but at the center of it, for the first time, there was no fear, only presence. He shifted the car into drive. The tires rolled softly over the pavement. As he pulled onto the road, the gas station light flickered one final time behind him, buzzing. Uncertain, but still burning, the city swallowed him back into its rhythm. Streetlights slid across his windshield in clean white lines, and in that moving reflection, the blurred merging of man and system, Judge Nathaniel Cross saw what endurance truly was, not power, not victory, but the quiet refusal to disappear. The hum of the engine joined the hum of the city, indistinguishable. He drove on, a solitary figure inside the machinery that had once confined him, now carrying within it the proof that dignity could live, even here. The system continued to turn. But somewhere within its grinding silence, a single voice had changed its pitch, and that was enough to make it tremble.